What happens when you chase after something, anything, chase after a dog, chase after anything? What happens? They start to move away from you. Have you ever been in a car and someone is tailgating you? So somebody is driving a car behind of you and getting closer and closer. How does that make you feel? You might get irritated. You might want to run away. So you might either make space for this person to drive past you, or you may start to speed up, right? So what happens when we chase something? That which we are chasing runs away from us, or at least wants to move away from us. So it's a bit like having these magnets. You might have seen that when you bring them closer, they go apart. You bring them closer, they go apart. What happens in codependent relationships? What happens in relationships where neither of you are giving each other any space? There's a lot of clinginess, there's a lot of neediness, and one of you or both of you are merely in it because you're somehow or the other feeding each other's needs, as opposed to you being in there, not because you're desperately trying to chase each other and secure each other. Because imagine that you're being chased, but you can't leave. Because you're being chased, you can't leave because you are in this marriage, or you're in a situation where you then can't go. How do you feel? How are you going to feel? You're going to feel stuck. You're going to feel resentment. Now, if that feeling of stagnation or whatever it is that you're feeling, anxiety, irritation, angry even, if it's not being channeled outwardly somehow, what are you going to do? It's going to fester inside of it. And when you fester inside of you, what's going to happen? Disease, ailments. So you see, you have some people who are with each other for a very long time. They're in a marriage together, and then you'll find that they both fall miserable. They fall really, really sick. Sometimes marriages work because of that one reason, that things, we are putting up with certain things. Then we find coping mechanisms. Now, which brings me to the point of today's post, which is about coping mechanisms. Now, what happens when we're being stifled because we're being chased, and that chasing feeling comes when something is trying to chase? Why do we chase? Because we are wanting. Why are we wanting? Because we are needy. Why are we needy? Because we have an unmet need inside of us, and ultimately the only person that's going to complete that need inside of us is us. That unmet need, yes, it may come from an infantile unmet need if you're talking about the development of your current mindset, which, remember, doesn't only depend on this present lifetime as you know it. It also depends on the kind of karma that you have come with and what you have decided that you're going to work on. So you come, which is the result of everything so far, and then you so far are reactive, mainly just going along with whatever it is that has been cast out for you. And then you come to a certain point where you are either going to carry on with the karmic pattern, or you're going to stop the karmic pattern. This is where you now can make it as you go along. So what happens when those needs haven't been met, and we say ultimately we are the ones who are going to complete our own needs, and we're going to remove this wanting? How is it that we then end up doing it? We end up doing it usually when we have an awakening. We realize that that unmet need comes from a complete disconnect that we feel from ourselves, we feel from the source of us. And this is where the concept of God comes in. This is where the concept of something higher than us comes in. The concept of divinity comes in. And this is where spiritual awakening comes in. And this is where we are all longing to belong, or you're seeking something bigger than. When you start to put things together and you can go beyond, oh, I think it was inner child healing, my needs were not met and therefore I'm like this, and then you heal, and then you may even be able to attract something else in your life. You may be in a different situation, but there'll be nothing that's long lasting. Nothing is really going to get it or get you until you fully anchor yourself into, I'm neither chasing, I'm nor repelling. but whatever I am on the outside is what is being reflected from my inside. Now, when you are completely connected with the source of it all, you're connected with all that is, you're connected, whether you want to call it God or a deity or a guru or whatever it is, but you don't feel a disconnect. That hole in you, gone. That feeling of void, gone. Right? So that you love your company, you love being with yourself, not because you're avoiding mingling or avoiding engaging or avoiding involving, because of course if you are to be in social situations, you are to be with other people, you won't feel uncomfortable because you've reached a point where you no longer hinge on anything outside of yourself, because you are no longer chasing and you're no longer in a place where you are operating from a need to cope with life. A need to cope with life comes from unmet needs, as we say, which comes from that feeling of disconnect. The disconnect that we are most likely to feel initially is the disconnect we feel when our initial caregivers and us did not form a connection that was dependable, reliable, that we knew it was going to be there because it was unconditional. We may have grown up with overly critical parents, an unstable home. And these places are the places that were rife for people that were going to grow up into individuals that were going to feel very disconnected, because that connection was never made. Now, when that connection was never made at that level, it's like the reptilian brain wasn't fed, the limbic brain wasn't fed. Now, without these parts of our brain being fed, that kicks us into a gear of survival mode, which basically keeps us in that, and it keeps us dense, and it keeps us wanting, and it disconnects us further to go beyond the animal to the human to the divine. So it keeps us in that, right? So that unmet need then becomes the very reason why the density starts to come in there. So we become more dense, and that starts to pull us down, and that keeps us in that wound of separation. Now, this is where the chasing and repelling comes in. When we are then in that wound of separation, or that separatedness that we feel, or that lack of disconnection that never happened with our initial caregivers, with our parents in our infancy, so when we never had that connection, right? So we stay in that. Now we stay in a mode of, how do I cope with the lack of connect? How do I cope with the disconnect? So what does a child do? The child will form a coping mechanism, and it can come in so many ways, and this will eventually lead to some other way that may have been masked by other things, other coping mechanisms. So the same coping mechanism as a child, so a child might act out, a child may become absolutely brilliant, people pleasing, and may go out of their way to get higher grades. They might work themselves really hard, and then even work themselves really hard, and they're constantly trying to prove themselves. And unbeknownst to them, they are constantly seeking the approval of the overcritical parent. And you'll find that these are the people who are going to be overcritical of themselves and of others who don't meet that standard, who don't meet them where they are, right? So if you are anyone who has not been able to go the extra mile like this other person, then chances are it's not going to work out. And these children who then later become adults will look for partners that mimic this situation. And the reason why this happens to us is because we are self-healing organisms. So the point of that is always for us to come back to a point, had we not been disconnected, so that we can come back to connect and therefore thrive, because we are not designed to survive. After all, we are not animals. We are designed to thrive, for us to be in our being and therefore use our intellect in order for us to understand why we are. And thereby you are able to ultimately manipulate energy, understand how energy works, understand the factory that you are. Now, what happens to this child? As an adult, this child then has a coping mechanism. Now, for some of the children, they might look to food as their coping mechanisms. They might look for anything. Now, what is the point of this coping mechanism? Is to allow you to cope with the naked truth that you cannot bear at that moment, because for you to accept the truth that either you were not loved or you were not met where you should have been met as that little child, the care you should have got, you didn't get, because to a child, to actually accept and to see that the parent was flawed, that they should have received that love, to that child, it's like cutting off their lifeline, their life support. Because to a child, it feels deathly to think that it could ever be possible that those that they're looking to reflect back who they are can possibly be flawed. So it isn't until much, much later in your lives, as you grow up, not just physically, but that part of you that is developmentally arrested because of the lack of connection finally stops sabotaging you, and then you move from that part of your brain, the reptilian brain, you move on to the part of your brain that would have naturally developed into, so you'll find that you're not needy, you're not chasing. Right? So you are no longer acting as a love repellent. You're no longer acting as a life repellent. But instead, you're attracting all of life because you're no longer coping. Now, the role of a coping mechanism is like that little tablet that you're swallowing so that you don't have to swallow the bitter truth. So in a way, if your coping mechanism is food and you gain weight, if your coping mechanism is to overwork yourself, if your coping mechanism is whatever it is, in a way that coping mechanism has saved you from what would have been very deathly, because that is like cutting off your life support. Except now that very coping mechanism becomes the very canker, becomes the very hindrance. We only realize that whatever we are doing is our way of coping with something when we awaken to this through an acute awareness of self. Without an awareness of self, pretty much all of life will be about what is being done to you, what is being said to you, without you taking any responsibility at all for how life is shaping for you and how you are actively making it happen for you. When you're not coping and you finally decide, I don't want to live my life from a point of coping. I don't want to cope with life. I am life. I want to make life. I want life to be as it would have been had I had that connection. And through your spiritual awakening, you realize, whoa, that connection was always there. So what's the secret? Not just the awakening. Now, what does your awakening actually do? which is where most of the pain lay and which is where the discomfort of a spiritual awakening lay. In facing that death, in facing that which you were refusing to face as a result of whatever you did to cope with it. Watching TV, eating certain foods, being in a certain way, dressing in a certain way, substance abuse, alcohol, whatever it is, anything outside of us that numbs it, anything that is saying, I don't need to face this, anything that is postponing the facing head on with that bitter truth. So what happens with the spiritual awakening? That veil is lifted. The coping mechanism has to go. Why? Because one of the tenets of the spiritual awakening is you becoming authentic, because you yourself are now providing you with a space that should have been there, right? But you are now giving yourself the space to step into your authenticity. And it's a gradual process for some of you. For some of you, it can take lifetimes. For some of you, it will not be. It'll be quite swift. You come into your own, and coming into your own basically means I don't need a coping mechanism. I've got this. And so you ask yourself, if it's not the coping mechanism and I'm coping with the fact that, you know what, actually there was a disconnect. And ultimately you realize that that disconnect was about you. And had it not been for the disconnect, you probably wouldn't even discover the biggest connection that you've always had. So in a way, and this is why there are some schools of thought, or you will hear people saying that it is through suffering that you can elevate yourself. You see, now that suffering provides us with the edge, it provides us with the converse, it provides us with the other side. Without the coping mechanism, you then go deep into the suffering. You embrace it, you allow it, you accept it. Now, this is where you might be bawling, you might be crying. When you get to the end of that suffering, that state, so you're allowing yourself, your heart is in pain, you are in pain, you're crying. Your mind is basically cognizing that which your body is feeling. And you're thinking of this, that I am suffering. And now when you get deeper into that suffering, and you just get into it, into it, what is going to happen? You will find that the suffering and the sufferer, right, are not the same. You will find that there is in fact no suffering. It's something for you to go through yourself, yeah? And which is why when you get through it and you realize that it is the awareness that remains unaffected. So the witness that is witnessing this and the awareness. So as you get deeper into the suffering, you get deeper into it. So it's like saying face your fears. Yeah, it's like saying to yourself, okay, so let's see where this is going to go. And you work through that and say, okay, if this doesn't happen, so then how is it going to make me feel? And ultimately you'll find yourself that you won't know what you're scared of. You won't know what am I suffering? Because what makes us feel pain and what makes us feel suffering, we are almost conditioned and designed to walk away from it, not to walk towards it. Yeah? Now, if you're walking away from it, and you see now you're walking away, what's going to happen? That suffering is going to come towards you. So it's not the actual suffering. So now that suffering will come towards you in how? Conditioned patterns of your existence. They will keep following you. So that suffering, you're literally, as you're running away from facing it, it's chasing after you. Yeah. As soon as you stop, you meet the suffering. You meet the suffering there. You embrace the suffering. You go deep into the crevices of this feeling. And you see what is going to happen when you go deep into that feeling. And for some of you, you may experience a dark night of the soul. You may experience all sorts of things during a spiritual awakening. And this is one of them, that you no longer have a coping mechanism because you no longer have the choice in this matter. Because if you're going to awaken, the one thing that you awaken to is that you are not the coping mechanism, you are not the experience. Neither of these things. Lots of love. Happy awakening.